Hey, everybody, and welcome to our week two lecture for the Stregoneria class, the Stregoneria 101 class. And this week we're going to be talking about deconstructing the myths around witchcraft itself. So I'm going to go ahead without any further delay and jump into a screen share. And we'll see how we do with this. Okay. So as I said, this is week two in our class. We're going to talk about deconstructing popular myths regarding witchcraft. And so when we talk about this topic, what we're really talking about is a lot of the mythology that has impacted and influenced the way that witchcraft is looked at in the 21st century. And so on the screen in front of you, you can see sort of a really overly simplified look at why this is so important. And the reason that we have this discussion at all is because we want to give you guys an opportunity to understand where some of the pushback, where some of the abrasion, and even some of the discrimination toward practitioners of folk magic exists in the current era. So in 1899, Charles Leland published his Vangelo, the Gospel of the Witches, or Aradia, as some of you might be familiar. And so between 1899 and I think 1923 was when Margaret Murray published her Witches Cult work, in which both of them theorized that the witchcraft in the ancient world could be traced back to the cult of Diana, and we'll talk about that. We're going to unpack that a little bit today. But by 1939, Gerald Gardner, who claims to have been initiated into a coven that no one ever heard of, with no proof of its existence to the present day, said that he was initiated in 1939. Several years later, he creates Wicca, a neo-pagan religion, and we have to underscore that it was a religion that was built around his misinterpretation of Charles Leland's finding. And as I said earlier, Madeline, or I always call her Madeline Murray, Margaret Murray's witch cult, and the connection that Gardner, I think the connection that he had to occultism, including the Golden Dawn and Rosicrucianism, really had the greater influence in the religion that he created. And then today, we've got modern witches who all claim to be related to the European witch cult, and unfortunately, their claim is a claim of being related to or linked to something that I don't believe ever existed. And the reason I don't believe that is purely academic and based on experience. And we're going to talk about that as well. So how do I know that Leland was wrong? Well, having been raised in the Afro-Siciliano and Italian traditions, as well as having spent 20 years of my time, as we talked about in the past, researching other regions of Italy, I'm absolutely certain that we do not speak of, teach, or share the tradition of Italian witchcraft, Italian magic, outside of our bloodlines. And that this, as many of you know, is the first time that it's being taught to people outside their bloodlines. So having grown up in that tradition, I know that the woman Madalena that Charles Leland says that he met would not have spilled the beans about witchcraft to him, and would not have invited him to see witchcraft being done by any group of Italian witches, first of all. Also, having grown up in the tradition, I was exposed to and involved in the old religion, what we call the Vecchia Religione, and they are two totally different things. So if you ask anyone in the Tuscan region today, they're going to tell you that the Vecchia Religione and the craft itself are two completely different things. Most of them will tell you that their craft doesn't even exist. They'll deny that witchcraft is even practiced anymore. They'll say, oh, there's some Catholic folk magic, segnatore, but that's really all that still remains. And that is because we don't talk about it. Now, in Leland's Gospel of Aradia, it purports to talk to give proof to the evidence of witchcraft existing. Well, the Gospel of Aradia has nothing to do with witchcraft in the Italian tradition. It is a liturgical rite that may or may not have any basis in reality. It may just be folklore that was created either by Maddalena or by Leland himself, that describes a religious liturgy. And so here's what I think actually took place. Charles Leland may have met somebody who claimed to be a practitioner, this woman, Maddalena. And if he did actually meet her, then it would not be unsurprising that Maddalena would have invited him to attend a gathering of the old religion, as this would satisfy his curiosity without revealing anything about the Italian witchcraft tradition itself, but it would have gotten him to stop asking questions. Now, there may or may not have been witches involved in the boschetto, in the grove that Leland witnessed. He may have just by conjecture thought that the people that he was seeing were witches. We're going to talk about that in a second. Or there may have been some witches who were involved in the boschetto, because witches were just as much involved in the old religion as bakers and butchers and teachers and shop owners. Now, Leland, being a non-Italian, would have probably imagined that all witches were part of this religion because of the Catholic and Anglican Church notion that was promoted since about 1400 in the Common Era, that witches were somehow involved in this this religion, or involved in league with the devil and all this other nonsense. And Gardner, later on, being of dubious integrity or ethics, may have just made up the story about initiation into a coven that no one ever heard of, based on what he read in Leland's account. And very much like Raven Grimassi would do decades later. Like Grimassi, Gardner created his own imaginary sect based on a legend he made up about a witch cult that never existed. So here's what I want you to do for the sake of this conversation. Let's imagine that you've never been to a Catholic church, never seen one, not seen one on TV, not seen one described in books, or not personally been to one. And let's say you walk into this Catholic church and the very first person you meet is a priest or a bishop. Now, not everybody that's in that church is a priest or a bishop. That priest or bishop might be wearing the same clothes as everybody else, or they may not. You might encounter a nun in that church, but not every person in the church is a nun. There are bakers and teachers and doctors and bookkeepers and shoe salesmen, dancers, cooks, yoga instructors. All of them may be in that church. See, you can't make an accurate assumption about the priesthood based on walking into a church, and you can't make an accurate assumption about Catholicism walking into a church. For the same reason, Leland couldn't make an accurate assumption about the priesthood of the old religion based on walking into a boschetto, or an accurate assumption on the religion itself based on walking into the boschetto. Now we add in something that further complicates that, and that is white privilege. Modern pagans have a tendency, in addition to pretending that witchcraft is a pagan religion, as opposed to a neo-pagan religious construct, to pretend that the world's languages and anthropology revolve around Old English. So you see these pretentious individuals, under the pretense of academic prowess and affected accent many times, attempting to portray themselves as scholars because they know the origins, or they know the uncertainty of the origins of the word witcha, which gets often mispronounced as Wicca by ignorant people like Gerald Gardner. And so because they know that we're not certain of the origins, that they can build their entire pretense of understanding the roots of witchcraft based on an Old English word or a Germanic word. And so these attempts by wealthy American white boys who claim to have figured it out seldom have any basis on true research or academia. So right off the bat, we need to say that that white privilege further complicates this and has for generations. So let's look at the facts. Let's look at the true academic foundation for what it is that I'm teaching. The first mention of witches occurs about 3,000 years ago, a little more than 3,000 years ago, or 3,000 years prior to the first mention of the Old English word witchet, and 3,500 years before Leland's Gospel of the Witches, about 4,700 years ago from this current era. And that first mention of the word witch, or of witches, of course, it wasn't in English, so it wasn't the word witch, but that first mention seems to have occurred at a time when sorcery and a belief in sorcery and its practice had been widespread in the Near East, the Nile Valley, especially in Babylonia. And so we find in 1754 BCE, in the Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest written texts that are known to humankind, the following prescription. In the Code of Hammurabi, actually the second section of that code, it says if a man has put a spell on another man and it is not justified, he upon whom the spell was placed shall go to the holy river, and into the holy river he shall plunge. And if the holy river overcomes him and he is drowned, the person who put a spell on him, i.e. the witch, shall take possession of his house. If the holy river declares him innocent and he remains unharmed, the person who placed the spell on him, i.e. again the witch, shall be put to death. He that plunged into the river shall take possession of the house of the one who laid the spell upon him. So let's be real clear what this is saying. This is saying that if someone put a spell on someone and it's not justified, so let's first make that note, that if somebody put a spell on you and it was justified, they were doing it for defensive purposes, or they were doing it to undo harm that you've done on them, that's justified. If it's unjustified, you did nothing to deserve someone putting a spell on you, then the person upon whom the spell was cast, the victim, if you will, goes to a holy river and submerges themselves. And if the river overcomes them, then the person who put a spell on them takes possession of the house, because it means that that spell was justified. If, on the other hand, the person who says that a spell was put on them goes to the river and they plunge into the river and they're not harmed, then that person can, the witch is put to death, and the person who the spell was placed on takes their property. So this is the very first and a very rational approach, it seems to me, to social justice within one of the oldest communities known to humankind concerning sorcery and the practice of witchcraft. Now, a lot of people will then say, well, we know that the Old Testament talks about witchcraft. And they bring up a quote in Exodus, which says, thou shalt, which is often interpreted in English to say, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, which may have nothing at all to do with witchcraft. The prescription in Hebrew is against those who whisper mystical phrases. That could easily refer to those from other spiritual traditions. So imagine, if you would, that the author of Exodus has encountered somebody from Tibet who's saying Om Mani Padme Hum. That's whispering a mystical phrase. Imagine that they come across somebody from Japan who's murmuring a particular phrase from Japanese Shinto. That would be the same word that would apply to that person. And in the book of Micah, also in the Jewish scripture, we're told that such mystics would be eliminated from the people of Israel. So essentially what's happening is, in the Jewish scripture, we're finding that there are prescriptions, just like the prescriptions against eating dairy and meat in the same dish, in the same bowl. These are prescriptions to prevent the Jewish people from dying to sickness and famine and death and infection and things like that. It's all about keeping the purity of their tradition. Because if we look at Deuteronomy, for example, we see that there's references in the Jewish scripture to the use of divination by the Levites, using crystals as well as a silver chalice for scrying. The Levites, Joseph is said to use the Urim and the Thummim, two particular crystals from the breastplate of Aaron, to be able to tell the future. Joseph's also said to use a silver chalice and then fill that chalice and use it for scrying. We call that water divination or bowl scrying. The book of Samuel talks about enlisting the services of a necromancer, someone who could talk to the dead, to summon the spirit of the deceased prophet Samuel. So clearly, Judaism does not have any prescriptions against the practice of magic or the practice of witchcraft. This, unfortunately, when the Greeks got a hold of it, was mistranslated, and they referred to, or they mistranslated the word in Hebrew to mean poisoner. And that is because the word for one who murmurs can actually be mistakenly broken into two parts, and that looks like somebody who uses herbs. And so in the Greek, it was translated to pharmakia. Now, if we look at other traditions around the same time, Islam only prescribes against evil magic, what the colonialists would refer to as black magic. They prescribe against any magic that doesn't come from the gifts given by Allah. In Cameroon, Jambe is the term used for witchcraft, a force inside a person which encompasses the occult, encompasses transformative power, and both encompasses the ability to kill and the ability to heal. Bruja in the Afro-Caribbean religion and healing tradition originates in Aruba and Bonaire and Curacao. And a healer in this culture is called a curioso or curado, and refers to a man or woman who performs what's called trabalho chiqui, which is little works, and trabalho grande, grand treatments, to promote or restore health, bring fortune or misfortune, to deal with unrequited love and more serious concerns in which sorcery is involved. Now, remember and put in your notes these two ideas, the trabalho chiqui and the trabalho grande, because we're going to talk about them in future classes. The little works and the great work. Now, in our own tradition in Italy, understanding the diverse practices of our people in Italy and Sicily requires that we look at the traditions that predate the Christian church. So often these people that pose as academics and experts with their YouTube channels and nonsense like that, they're looking at things that took place in the Middle Ages. And so everything, whether they know it or not, is being framed in a framework, a false framework that was given to them by the church, by the oppressor itself. Remember that the word witch, strega, or witchcraft, stregoneria, was never used by our people to describe what we do any more than it was used by any other tradition prior to the Middle Ages. So this whole nonsense about, we have to look at what the word witch means and how it's mispronounced and blah, blah, blah. Who the fuck cares? It's not relevant to the actual understanding of witchcraft as an authentic tradition, as an authentic practice. It doesn't matter what when the Old English word was used, what it was used, what it meant, whether it was translated correctly or incorrectly or anything else. See, the privileged white boys in the United States tend to think that witchcraft must not have existed outside of the religious cults that were created in the 1950s. Because they like to pretend that they weren't just created in the 50s. Those cults that were created in the 50s were based on the false assertion that the old religion of Tuscany was a cult of witches. And we know that that's incorrect. And it's easy to prove that it's not correct by talking to real Italians whose families have really practiced both the old religion and witchcraft. Now, let's look at some of the different areas within Italy to understand this diversity from which our tradition comes. In the Regione Piemonte, which is the Piedmont and Aosta Valley region, Mascone and Masca are found. And the names Mascone and Masca probably derive from the Lombardy term masca, which indicates the soul of a dead man, or possibly we're not really clear on whether there might be some Provençal influence here. The Provençal mascar, which means to mumble, again, see the connection to the Jewish tradition there, in the sense of mumbling spells or whispering spells. Now, according to tradition, the initiate inherits the craft from grandmother to grandson, or from mother to child, and his supernatural powers, as well as what we call the Book of Command, a library containing formulas and spells as a spellcaster, are transmitted from grandmother to grandson or from mother to child. This would be similar to the British tradition of a grimoire. In the Lombardy region, witches are called strie, which derives from striaria, the dialectic term for witchcraft. We believe that this probably comes from that same root for the word for screech, and the sound that's made by an owl, a barn owl, for example. But precisely in this region, in Lombardy, in Bergamo, the Mask of the Harlequin is born, which, according to some scholars, would testify to the cult of Bacchus or Pan or Luperco. And in fact, the clothing and appearance of the Harlequin would recall the costumes of pre-Christian priests who smeared their faces on some of the festivals of Bacchus, for example, to appear like the Harlequin. And it's no coincidence that other Lombardy figures like Krampus, depicted as demons in the company of San Nicolo, who traditionally were young men disguised as devils on December 5th, can also be directly linked to Faunus or Pan. The same thing with Bodalisek, the mythological being who lives in the woods and is represented as being big-headed, made of wood and covered with goat hair. We start to see this overlap of some of the ancient mythos with this particular region, and that should make it a little bit easier to understand how somebody from the outside would confuse the difference between the practice of witchcraft and the practice of some of these old religious traditions. In Veneto, the witches are called belle butelle, the beautiful girls. In myth, they're associated with a type of fairies or water nymphs. Sometimes they're only seen as entities of the water, but both in spirit, both as spirits and as witches, physical witches, alike. And according to tradition, the belle butelle live in various natural cavities or purges, in what we call the buci or cavoli, the caves, which are scattered everywhere on the mountains and hills. They operate only at night, and they particularly become active around the full moon and retire, disappearing without leaving a trace in the morning. This would be a legend, the story of the belle butelle, that would be picked up upon by the church. As they started to say that these witches would come out and steal the souls of children at night. In Liguria, the witches are called the Bagere, which and sorcerers of the whole region are said to gather on the nights between Wednesday and Thursday and between Friday and Saturday, carrying brooms and sticks onto which candles are fixed so that they can light their way as they go into their areas of practice. And according to the Romanazzi, the cult of the Great Mother has always been present in the Ligurian territory, as has been a devotion to the Great Father. Now, in the countryside and in Molise, there's a particular variant of the witch called the Janata, or the male equivalent, Maone. And the Janata is a woman who's born on the full moon on Christmas Eve, who receives her magical knowledge on this day. So here is the first mention that we actually see in recording of history of a tradition that's passed down on Christmas Eve in the Italian folk magic tradition. According to the traditions in Liguria, these witches could only be detected during the Christmas Eve Mass, as one has to enter the church dressed as the Grim Reaper. And the legend goes that in the presence of the Grim Reaper, a witch can't leave the building. And so on Christmas Eve, you come into the church dressed as a Grim Reaper. Everybody else leaves because they're scared of the Grim Reaper. It's a tongue twister. And the ones that remain present are the ones that are Janata or Maone. So we start to see now this connection between the old tradition of witchcraft and discovering them in the church, which would also lead to in Italian folk magic traditions to this idea that the tradition is passed on at Christmas Eve in the more modern expression of the tradition. Now we can talk about all of the different regions in Italy, but some of the ones that I think are the most relevant to our class in Calabria, the witches are called Magari. They know the secrets of herbs and spells and jetties, which they use to remove and to send, either to remove the evil eye or to send the evil eye, to remove illness or to send illness. In Puglia, the witches are called Masciare or Stiare. And according to legend, the Stiare are women who have the power to use ointments or tinctures and lotions to turn into cats and to go meet at night under a large walnut tree and dance and have fun and frolic. And their interventions are always seen as being harmful. So they're seen as being, that's the idea of the black cat being bad luck. They're seen as being they are leading to death. Now the Masciare have the same abilities, but they're the beneficial version. So the Stiare would be the practitioners of a darker magic. The Masciare are the beneficial magic, and they remove the evil eye. They do the Maloicchio. They work for good, for healing. And sometimes the distinction between the two is absent, and the person who transforms into a cat is referred to in some historical texts as the Gatte Masciare. So they didn't necessarily see a strict line between the Stiare and Masciare. So they didn't see a strict line between good and bad magic. And I think that as we start to notice that more and more in the literature, we start to recognize that our tradition has never seen that straight line, that probably that division was actually made by outsiders, or was a construct of outsiders. Now, traditional Apulian dance, what we call the pizzica and the tarantismo, were dances that were Christianized by replacing the dance itself, which was done in honor of Dionysus, with St. Paul. And St. Paul would become the patron saint of tarantulas, and those who were stung by a tarantula, according to the magical tradition, could heal the bug bite, the spider bite, by doing a particular dance, which many of you know from Italian tradition and from the popular song, the Tarantella. And so this originally started out in Puglia as a dance that was done as sort of a magic spell to help save the person who was bitten by the bug. It's more likely from a medical perspective that by swirling around and dancing around like that, you increased your circulation, you got the poison to actually circulate more quickly through your body so that it did less harm. Now, here's what we did. The practitioners of the ancient craft of the wise were healers. We were seers. We were midwives to the newborn and the dying. We were herbalists. We were feminists. We were hexers and necromancers. And then as we started to approach the 1600s, the intellectual movement began to emerge more and more in Italy. And the movement within the halls of the Vatican, which we'll talk about later in the course, would simultaneously drive our practices deeper and deeper into secrecy. So you had this intellectual movement known as Illuminism that was a belief that only the goddess of reason should be honored and should replace the practice of the craft. So we now need to be strictly based on rationalism and reason in our approach. Simultaneously in the Vatican, there was this group of people who were perceived to be witch hunters called the Benedanti, who were seen to practice a beneficent type of magic, who in fact were a nefarious group who wanted to simply stop the practice of women, of powerful women witches, and take all of the magic, all of the secrets, and hold it within the clergy. It was a power grab. Now, Romanticism would emerge in an attempt to revive a reliance and a respect for the craft. But by that period, the Benedante agenda and secular intellectualism had gained a foothold, and so Romanticism didn't succeed in really bringing witchcraft back into its own, back out of the shadows. And then positivism further drove our practices into secrecy, although their objectives were always similar to our own, that science would lead the way. For witches, the only difference is that we consider magic to be science that's not yet fully understood. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there from understanding the objectives of positivism and the objectives of our tradition. Here's what we understand. In our tradition, and this is where we begin to actually study what Stregoneria believes and teaches. We believe that the universe is wholly and entirely comprised of energy, which can neither be created nor destroyed. And science has meted that out. We believe that magic or witchcraft is the skillful manipulation of energy. We believe that the medium through which matter is manifest is known as thought. Science referred to this in 1913. Einstein called this zero-point energy. It was what we now know as dark matter. Now, we believe that mastery of the use of thought or dark matter and the manipulation thereof gives one the mastery of inner alchemy, and as a result, domination over the apparent forces of the manifest world. In other words, if we can learn to master our minds, we learn to master thought, that gives one mastery of inner alchemy. And once one has mastered their inner alchemy, they can master external alchemy or outer alchemy. The mastery of thought is increased when there's harmony with the laws of nature, of Hermeticism, and with the vibrational impulse of Source itself. So we believe that our mastery improves the more we work with nature rather than against nature, with the laws of Hermeticism rather than against them. And in so doing, we raise our vibration to be more sympathetic to or more in harmony with the impulse of Source itself, by whatever name you choose to call that source. So what about paganism? And how does that fit in the picture? Well, this is another area where neo-pagans often take the story in a completely different direction and try to pass it off as academia. The word pagan comes from the Latin word paganus, which originally simply meant a country dweller or a civilian. Now that word, again, was co-opted by the Roman Catholic Church, which fancied its adherents as the army of Christ, and which pejoratively referred to those who were non-adherents as civilians, pagans. So you were either part of the army or you were part of the civilian life. The civilian life were the pagans. In the modern world, pagan is used incorrectly to refer to what would more accurately be described as neo-pagans. Neo-pagans are reconstructionists and often revisionists who created belief systems around interpretations and misinterpretations of the ancient cult of the gods and the goddess of antiquity. And neo-paganism began around the 1940s, 1950s. Now, what about the Vecchia Religione? Well, we simply have no way of knowing whether the stories of the Vecchia Religione in the Tuscan region is as old as our Italian legends claim. However, there is evidence among many of the families throughout Italy and Greece that there were devotions to the ancient mother, to Uni, particularly at Lake Nemi, dating back to about 1,000 years before the Common Era. Uni is also known as Diana. And that these devotions to Diana seem to have continued in families and in villages in unbroken succession to the present day. So whether they go back more than 1,000 years, we're not sure. We have no real way of proving that. But nowhere in any of the ancient traditions is there any link between this devotion to Diana, this devotion to the Blessed Mother, and witchcraft. So we don't see any links between the ancient religion and the craft prior to the 14th and 15th centuries of the Common Era, when the church was making those accusations. Now remember, there's a big difference between the reality and the accusation. So therefore, we can know with certainty that the Vecchia Religione and some hereditary forms of Hellenistic religious traditions may still exist to this day, and would indeed be called pagan and not neo-pagan. So the practice, the religious practice of my family that practiced the Vecchia Religione would be classified as a pagan religion because it's continued back at least 1,000 years before the Common Era. Some of the practices in Greece and Cyprus, again, would be pagan traditions because they've been handed down generation after generation after generation, unlike neo-pagan religions like Wicca and things like that, and Alexandrian magic and all of that, which were created in the 50s. Now, other forms of authentically ancient witchcraft and magic that exist in the world that we can trace and see the ancient roots that had nothing to do with the worship of the goddess, that had nothing to do with religion, and that might include connections in various traditions to various parts of religions, include brujeria, santeria, curandero, the African Inyanga and Isangoma, the West African Obeya, the Navajo skinwalkers, or the Yi Naldushi, which I probably just completely slaughtered how that's pronounced, the Japanese Kitsune Mochi, the Russian Vedma, the Romani, the shamans of every stripe. These are all forms of ancient witchcraft and magic that did not always involve worship of the goddess or a ritual ceremonial initiation. Initiation, remember, can take place from a grandmother teaching her grandson. The word initiation is another one of those terms that neo-pagans get hung up on because they think that the only way you can be initiated is the way that they were initiated. And that just demonstrates a lack of academic or intellectual maturity as well as spiritual maturity. Now let's talk a little bit about 20th century witchcraft. Despite the mythos upon which many of these 20th century creators of the various neo-pagan traditions claim that their sects were based, there's no evidence, there's no real valid anthropology to link any of their practices to the ancient world, other than a devotion to goddesses and gods by the same name that were written about throughout time. There's no connection to the practice of witchcraft that exists because the practice of witchcraft was never a religion. And neo-paganism is in fact a religion first and foremost. So this notion that that Gardner and Murray promoted, that these religious gatherings were gatherings of witches, were false. The creators of neo-pagan traditions were often influenced more by the occult traditions and philosophical traditions that were largely based on interpretations of the mystery school, what we call the perennialist traditions of ancient Egypt and the Near East, or Far Eastern philosophy, and newer ideologies like Theosophy and New Thought and Luciferianism. These traditions were almost always traditions that understood magic within its proper context. Unfortunately, that proper context gets lost when you get some of these neo-pagan practitioners trying to create their own version, their own religion around them. So what are some of these 20th century religions, these 20th century expressions of witchcraft that we have? And I put these in alphabetical order, not in chronological order, so that we don't get caught up in the arguments about which ones came first. First, we have Alexandrian witchcraft, which claims to be an hereditary tradition, but offers zero evidence of support of such claims. Alexandrian witchcraft also appears to be suspiciously similar in content and philosophy to Gardnerian witchcraft. Was created by a man by the name of Alex Sanders. So it's really important to remember too, a lot of people get this part wrong, that the word Alexandrian has no real links to Alexandria as an ancient city, has no real links to Egypt or anything of that nature, as some from outside the tradition suggest erroneously. It is a ceremonial magical tradition and religion into which aspects of witchcraft have been fully interwoven. Now, the next type of witchcraft that I would talk about would be Cabot witchcraft. It's probably one of the most pragmatic of the modern witchcraft traditions, in my opinion, because it actually teaches the science and art of witchcraft, which are taught with distinctively ancient elements of accuracy. It is it's blended with the Celtic religion. It's woven into a cohesive tapestry of magic and religion that I think deserves a lot more credit than it often gets. Now, alongside of that, we have Celtic witchcraft, which is an ancient hereditary practice, which many believe the religion and the practice of the craft have always been inextricably interwoven in Celtic witchcraft, and that may very well be the case. Continuing, we have Dionic witchcraft, which weaves neo-pagan revival of worship of the goddess Diana, or Uni, with the 20th century interpretations of witchcraft believed to likely have been more folk magic based in the tradition of the folk magic of the British Isles. Often Dionic witchcraft is interwoven into this secretive religion, mystery school tradition, and is the questionable mythos that's presented by Charles Leland's Vangelo, where he claims it to be to have been a boschetto, one of the boschettos of a grove of witches rather than a religious tradition. Fairy is a neo-pagan tradition that was created by Gwydion Pedersen and Victor Anderson, that was inspired clearly by Gerald Gardner's work. Gardnerian witchcraft itself was created by Gerald Gardner, who claimed to have been initiated, as I said earlier, into a coven that was never proven to have actually existed. And there is great reason to hold his claim as highly suspect. Subsequently, the ethos, the practice, the mythological connection to antiquity would end up perverting the anthropological record and inspiring many similar tales to be told in the generations that follow, because Gardner and his 20th century tradition would give rise to other traditions like Wicca and Green Witchery and eclectic witchcraft and Saxon witchcraft and so forth. And then finally, in the realm of 20th century witchcraft, unfortunately, I have to mention the Stregoneria, a religion that has zero foundation in either antiquity or modernity prior to its inception by an American Wiccan practitioner named Raven Gramasi, that bears no connection to Italian witchcraft, despite the name that he gave it, no connection whatsoever to Italian folk magic in the least. Stregoneria is essentially Wicca with Italian seasoning. Now, I want to be really clear, and if there was one thing that you can take away from this first class that's critically important and often overlooked, it is that new does not mean bad. Simply by exposing an erroneous myth, the foundational myth behind most neo-pagan religions and traditions, doesn't mean that it invalidates their practice, their tradition, or their magic. So I really want you to understand that Alexandrian magic and Cabot magic and Gardnerian magic, all of these practices of the craft that grew out of the 1950s are every bit as valid as the practice of witchcraft in the ancient world. And it's important that we understand that. And here's one of the reasons why, because in a very real way, the way in which this 26-week course that I'm sharing with you guys in Italian traditional witchcraft and folk magic needs to be considered to be among not just the modern group of practices like Wicca and Alexandrian magic and Cabot magic, but I really believe this is the first postmodern form of witchcraft, rather than an ancient form or a neo-pagan tradition, because this is not going to represent any kind of religious tradition. This is taking things to the next level, and my hope is that we inspire other magical practitioners to stop drawing lines in the sand, to stop, to momentarily set aside their eyeliner long enough to realize how stupid they sound when they pretentiously claim that those who practice, whose expression or practice of the craft is not ceremonially initiated or based on goddess worship, are not legitimately practicing the craft. And for those people to consider sitting down and shutting up and allowing the magic to express itself organically. See, that's the whole reason I'm teaching this class. And for those who insist, I will wrap up this class by saying to the pretentious little boys whose white privilege inspires them to claim that one must worship the goddess and be initiated into a neo-pagan religious cult in order to, quote unquote, legitimately practice the craft, as they call it, or to legitimately call themselves witches or warlocks. If you're that certain that your absurd claims are real, please, by all means, come knock on my door and allow me to clip a few locks of your hair, your nails, and your clothing. Otherwise, as we magically say in Philadelphia, shut the fuck up, Mary. That's all I got to say about this. I'll look forward to talking with you guys on Monday about this first segment, this first chapter in our 26-week. That's actually the second week's class, but digging deeper into this first chapter of discussion for us as a community. We'll talk to you soon. Stay in the moment. Be grateful for everything you've got. Always remember that when you return your mindfulness to the present moment, that's where the magic happens. And always remember, my friends, the best is yet to come. We'll look forward to talking to you on Monday night in our class.